Paradigms shape the way we see the world, but paralysis begins when we believe the way things have been is the way they must always be. Some of us are stuck, not because God has withdrawn his hand, but because our minds have settled into patterns that no longer serve where he's trying to take us. A paradigm becomes a prison when you refuse to challenge it. It becomes a ceiling when you treat it like a foundation. And before life ever cages your circumstances, it cages your thinking. There are moments when God invites us into a new dimension, but we hesitate because the familiar feels safer than the unknown. We cry out for transformation, yet cling to the comfort of routine. We want elevation without disruption. We want change without challenge. We want progress without pressure. But God doesn't renovate your life using old blueprints. He introduces shifts, divine interruptions, spiritual earthquakes that shake the assumptions you've built your identity on. That shaking is not punishment, it's preparation. It's heaven telling you, you can't stay here and become who you were created to be. Paralysis doesn't always show up as physical immobility. Sometimes it disguises itself as procrastination, overthinking, fear, doubt, or the endless rehearsing of what-ifs that never lead to action. You are not stuck because you lack ability. You are stuck because you've talked yourself out of possibility. You've let the culture define your capacity. You've allowed past failures to become present limits. You've handed your perspective the authority that belongs to your purpose. And whenever perspective becomes louder than purpose, paralysis follows. But here's the good news. God never confronts your mindset without simultaneously awakening your movement. Every divine word is an invitation to rise. Every promise is a push. Every storm is a signal that something in you is still alive, still capable, still necessary. The presence of pressure is proof that heaven has not dismissed your destiny, and the moment you challenge the paradigm, the paralysis begins to lose its grip. This is the season to break the pattern. This is the time to question the lies you've whispered to yourself for years. You've rehearsed defeat long enough. You've explained your limitations long enough. You've dressed up dysfunction and called it personality long enough. It's time to see differently so you can move differently. You cannot enter new doors with old eyes. You cannot step into purpose with a mindset built on survival. God is stretching you into who you were always meant to be, and the greatest battle is not around you. It's within you. If you dare to believe that change is possible, if you allow God to reset the lenses through which you view your life, then the paralysis that has held you hostage will lose its justification. Your faith will begin to outrun your fear. Your courage will rise above your excuses, and you will discover that the only thing that ever needed to shift was your perspective. Paradigms can imprison, but they can also be transformed. And the moment your thinking changes, your life will follow. Today is your moment to move, because breakthrough doesn't begin with your feet. It begins with your mind. Paradigms shape perception and can become prisons when left unchallenged. The most powerful limitations in life are not the ones built around us, but the ones built within us. A paradigm is simply the lens through which we interpret reality. It determines what we call possible, what we label impossible, what we fear, what we pursue, and what we expect from ourselves and from God. But when a paradigm becomes rigid, when it stops growing with you, it slowly transforms from a helpful framework into an invisible cage. You start living inside boundaries you didn't consciously choose, boundaries formed by past experiences, disappointments, cultural conditioning, and even generational patterns. Over time, the paradigm becomes so familiar that you stop questioning it, because it feels normal. But normal is not the same as true, and comfort is not the same as destiny. The danger of an unchallenged paradigm is that it convinces you that what you see is all there is. It teaches you to interpret every new opportunity through old pain. It persuades you to approach every open door with the memory of closed ones. You begin to make decisions not based on who you are becoming, but based on who you used to be. And when your perception is trapped, your potential becomes trapped with it. The world outside you may be wide open, but the world inside you is locked. You live beneath your calling, not because God has withheld something from you, but because your paradigm has edited your vision. Every major shift God brings into your life starts with a confrontation of how you think. Before he moves your feet, he moves your perspective. Before he elevates your status, he expands your sight. Because if you enter a new season with an old mindset, the season will change, but you won't. You'll still interpret growth as danger, still see blessings as burdens, still treat opportunities as threats. A hardened paradigm can blind you to divine appointments, mute God's instructions, and restrict the very breakthroughs you've prayed for. You cannot walk boldly into what you cannot see clearly. This is why some people stay in the same emotional and spiritual cycles for years. It's not that change isn't available. It's that the paradigm refuses to release them. They are loyal to the way things have always been, even when those ways no longer serve them. They rehearse old narratives, cling to outdated beliefs, and defend limitations that were never meant to be permanent. And the moment you defend a limitation, you empower it. You give it authority over your decisions, your relationships, your courage, and your future. To break free, you must be willing to examine what you've accepted as truth. You must be brave enough to interrogate the assumptions you've repeated for so long that they feel like facts. And you must allow God to challenge the very thoughts you've built your identity on. Because the real bondage is never the circumstance. It's the paradigm that tells you the circumstance defines you. And until you confront that inner prison, the outer world will never feel big enough to contain who you truly are. Paralysis begins in the mind long before it appears in behavior. Long before your feet stop moving, your thoughts have already come to a halt. Before you ever pause in your actions, something has paused inside your spirit. This internal stillness often disguises itself as caution, wisdom, or timing, but at its core, it is a silent surrender to fear, doubt, or exhaustion. What looks like inaction on the outside is usually the product of invisible battles on the inside, battles between what you hope for and what you fear might happen, between the truth God has spoken and the lies you've believed for years. Mental paralysis is subtle. It creeps in quietly, one hesitant thought at a time, until your dreams lose their momentum and your enthusiasm loses its voice. You don't wake up paralyzed overnight. It happens gradually. It starts when you begin replaying past failures more than future possibilities. It grows when you overthink decisions instead of making them. It deepens when fear becomes your counselor and comfort becomes your refuge. The mind creates endless scenarios, most of which never happen, and in trying to prepare for every outcome, you end up prepared for none. The weight of what if becomes heavier than the promise of what could be. You hesitate, then delay, then stall, and eventually freeze. By the time your life shows symptoms of paralysis, your mind has already been locked in place. The struggle intensifies when your inner dialogue works against your destiny. The voice of insecurity whispers that you are not enough. The voice of fear insists that the risk is too big. The voice of past trauma warns that the pain will repeat itself. These internal messages shape your responses more than any external circumstance ever could. You're not held back by obstacles but by interpretations. How you translate what happens to you and what you believe it means about you. When those translations are distorted, paralysis becomes the natural response. You move less because you believe less. You attempt less because you expect less. The battlefield is never your environment. It's always your perception. Mental paralysis is also fueled by the pressure to appear strong while feeling weak. Many people don't move, not because they don't want to, but because they're afraid of failing publicly. They fear judgment, rejection, and disappointment. So they stay still, hoping that the absence of action will protect them from the possibility of pain. But in trying to avoid hurt, they also avoid healing. In trying to avoid risk, they also avoid reward. Stillness becomes a shield and a prison at the same time. Yet the truth remains, your mind is the gatekeeper of your movement. Before your life can advance, your thoughts must be released. Before your hands can work, your inner narrative must shift. Recognizing that paralysis starts internally gives you power, because what begins in the mind can be broken in the mind. Once you confront the thoughts that have been holding you hostage, you can reclaim your ability to move, decide, build, and become. The moment your thinking awakens, everything else in your life begins to rise with it. God uses disruption to break limiting patterns and usher in transformation. Disruption is rarely comfortable, but it is often essential. When God interrupts your plans, it is not to punish you, but to reposition you. He shakes what is familiar so that what is greater can emerge. We often assume that stability is the proof of God's presence, but throughout Scripture and throughout our own lives, it is usually the disturbance, the unexpected, the uncomfortable, the unplanned, that signals God is at work. Disruption is His way of loosening your grip on patterns that have shaped you for too long, especially those patterns that have quietly restricted your growth. Every major shift in destiny comes wrapped in some form of disturbance. Think about the seasons you grew the most. They were rarely birthed in convenience. Growth demands friction, an agitation of the mind, a stirring of the heart, a shaking of the routine. Without disruption, you would cling to the life you've outgrown. You would remain in relationships, environments, and mindsets that no longer serve your purpose. The very patterns that once protected you would become the chains that hold you back. Sometimes God must break what you've settled into so He can reveal what you were made for. He disrupts the cycle so He can deliver the calling. The challenge is that we often misinterpret the disruption. We see it as rejection, hardship, or chaos, when in reality it is divine realignment. God does not disrupt what He intends to destroy. He disrupts what He intends to develop. He allows discomfort to draw you out of spiritual autopilot. He lets the ground beneath you shake, so you stop building your identity on unstable foundations. He removes certain people, opportunities, or assurances not to diminish you, but to free you from attachments that could not accompany you into your next dimension. Sometimes the friction you resist is the very friction that is preparing you for expansion. Disruption also disrupts your thinking. It forces you to reconsider the beliefs you've accepted without question. It exposes the limits you didn't realize you had embraced. When routine becomes too predictable, your vision becomes too small. You stop imagining possibilities beyond your current reality. But when God interrupts that rhythm, Suddenly you are awakened. You start asking new questions. You start seeking him with fresh urgency. You start seeing what you ignored and hearing what you once dismissed. Disruption clears away the noise of normalcy so you can hear the whisper of destiny. And in that disruption, God reveals capacities you didn't know you had. You learn resilience you never had to use before. You discover creativity that pressure pulls to the surface. You tap into spiritual strength that comfort never required. Disruption births a new version of you, one that is stronger, wiser, braver, and more aligned with who God intended you to be. It shifts not only your situation, but your self-awareness. And once you see what has been hiding in you, you can never return to who you were. Disruption is not the enemy of purpose, it is the doorway to it. It breaks the patterns that keep you small so God can usher you into the transformation that makes you whole. Fear, overthinking, and past failures create mental paralysis that blocks movement. Long before a person stops progressing outwardly, the internal voices of anxiety and hesitation have already seized control. Fear is one of the most persuasive immobilizers because it convinces you that danger exists even when you're standing in safety. It magnifies the worst case scenario until it overshadows the promises God has spoken over your life. You begin expecting defeat before you even try, rehearsing disaster before you take a single step. Fear does not need real evidence, it thrives off imagination, and once imagination is contaminated, movement becomes impossible. Overthinking adds another layer to the paralysis. It overloads your mind with endless loops of possibilities, calculations, doubts, and hypotheticals. Instead of making one decision, you analyze 10 possible outcomes. Instead of taking one step, you forecast 1,000 directions. The mind becomes so full that it cannot flow. You find yourself exhausted from battles that only happened in your thoughts. Overthinking convinces you that preparation is happening, when in reality, it is just polished procrastination. It gives you the illusion of movement while keeping you firmly in the same place. You create strategies but never execution, plans but never progress, dreams but never delivery. Past failures deepen the paralysis because they act as constant reminders of what didn't work before. You begin to treat every new opportunity like an old wound. The disappointment that once visited temporarily becomes a permanent roommate in your psyche. Instead of using the past as a teacher, you elevate it into a prophet, assuming what hurt you yesterday will haunt you tomorrow. Trauma rewires your expectations. Loss reshapes your bravery. The memory of failure becomes louder than the possibility of success. And even when God opens a door, you hesitate because you fear walking back into the same pain. What makes this form of paralysis so dangerous is that it operates silently. On the outside, you still appear functional. You go to work, show up for others, maintain routines, and carry responsibilities. But internally, you are frozen. You're present but not progressing. You're surviving but not advancing. People around you may not recognize it, but you feel it every time you talk yourself out of a chance, every time you shrink to avoid disappointment, every time you silence your own potential just to stay emotionally safe. Fear convinces you that standing still is protection, but in reality, standing still is surrender. You begin to negotiate with your own destiny. You downsize your dreams. You lower your expectations. You settle for environments that don't challenge you because challenge feels too risky. You choose predictability over purpose and comfort over calling. But deep inside, you sense the contradiction. Something in you knows you were meant for movement. Something in you aches for more. Something in you realizes that the paralysis is not who you are. It is just what fear has talked you into becoming. This inner conflict reveals the truth. If fear, overthinking, and past failures can freeze you, then confronting them can free you. The battle is not with the obstacles ahead, but with the narratives within. And the moment those narratives shift, your steps will follow. A shift in perspective is the first step toward breaking spiritual and emotional stagnation. Before anything in your life can change, something within you must awaken. Perspective is the lens through which you interpret every situation, every challenge, and every opportunity. When that lens is clouded by fear, trauma, disappointment, or limited thinking, everything you see becomes distorted. Even blessings look threatening. Even open doors look unstable. Even progress feels overwhelming. But when perspective shifts, clarity returns, and clarity has the power to redirect an entire destiny. The greatest breakthroughs do not begin with miracles. They begin with a renewed mind. You can be standing in the center of possibility and still feel stuck if your perspective is anchored to the past. Old interpretations create new limitations. If you see yourself through the lens of what hurt you, you will expect pain even in places designed for healing. If you see yourself through the lens of past failure, you will assume defeat even when success is within reach. Perspective shapes expectation, and expectation shapes behavior. A limited view produces limited movement. You will only pursue what you believe is attainable, and you will only fight for what you believe is worth having. Without a shift in perspective, stagnation becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. The challenge is that perspective often becomes invisible. It hides behind familiarity. It disguises itself as personality or practicality. You begin to believe that the way you see things is simply the way things are. But the truth is, perception is not reality. It is interpretation. It is the story you tell yourself about what you experience, and sometimes that story needs to be rewritten. When God is trying to elevate you, He doesn't start by changing your situation. He starts by challenging your interpretation. He exposes the thoughts that have become barriers and reveals assumptions you didn't even know you made. He invites you to see through His eyes because His perspective reveals possibilities that your pain could not see. A shift in perspective often requires humility, the willingness to admit that your view has been too small. It demands honesty, the courage to confront the beliefs that have shaped your actions. It calls for openness, the readiness to embrace truths that contradict your fears. And it requires faith, the certainty that God's vision for your life is bigger than your current understanding. When perspective shifts, strength rises. When perspective shifts, courage awakens. When perspective shifts, you stop shrinking to fit old patterns and start stretching into new capacity. Perspective does not just determine how you see your life. It determines how you see yourself. If you see yourself as broken, you will behave as though healing is unreachable. If you see yourself as insignificant, you will approach opportunities as though they are too big for you. But when you see yourself as God sees you, capable, chosen, strengthened, and equipped, your decisions change. You speak differently, move differently, and expect differently. And expectation becomes a magnet for transformation. Stagnation breaks the moment you allow your mind to expand beyond the limits of yesterday. When you embrace a new perspective, you step into a new level of possibility. You move not because the situation changes, but because you change. And once that internal shift happens, the external world rearranges itself to match the new vision you carry. Breakthrough begins when faith overrides familiar patterns and empowers new action. Many people desire change but remain tethered to the routines that keep them safe, predictable, and emotionally undisturbed. Familiarity can feel comforting, even when it is limiting. You can become attached to routines that no longer serve your growth simply because they don't challenge you. But nothing transforms in the realm of comfort. Faith steps into the unfamiliar, pushes against the expected, and demands movement where stagnation once lived. Breakthrough is not an accident. It is the result of intentional steps taken in a direction your old patterns would have never allowed. Every familiar pattern has a voice, and that voice often whispers reasons to stay where you are. It reminds you of every mistake you've made, every risk that went wrong, every moment you felt unprepared or inadequate. Patterns rooted in fear will always argue for safety. Patterns rooted in insecurity will always demand permission. Patterns rooted in trauma will always anticipate pain. And as long as those patterns dominate your choices, breakthrough remains a distant desire instead of a present reality. Faith does not silence the fears, but it speaks louder than them. Faith interrupts the cycle by saying, "Move anyway." Faith reveals what fear conceals. Fear magnifies obstacles. Faith magnifies God's ability to guide you through them. Fear rehearses the worst. Faith anticipates the best. Fear keeps you calculating. Faith keeps you moving. When faith overrides familiarity, you begin to act on what God has spoken rather than what your past has shown. You stop waiting for perfect conditions and start trusting divine timing. You stop waiting to feel ready and start understanding that readiness comes through movement, not before it. Faith produces a holy confidence that empowers you to step into what you cannot yet fully see but deeply sense. Breakthrough happens the moment your decisions align with your destiny rather than your history. You may still feel unqualified, but faith pushes you to apply. You may still feel unsure, but faith urges you to try. You may still feel afraid, but faith guides you to show up anyway. Every act of obedience breaks a piece of the old pattern. Every step taken in faith weakens the grip of the familiar. Movement itself becomes a weapon, a declaration that you are no longer governed by what used to intimidate you. A single courageous choice can disrupt years of stagnation. What faith ultimately does is awaken the part of you that has been dormant under discouragement, disappointment, and self-doubt. It reminds you that you were created for more than survival. It ignites a fire that routine cannot extinguish. It restores vision where blindness once lived. And as you move in faith, you begin to attract opportunities, connections, and clarity that were hidden until you stepped forward. Breakthrough is rarely sudden. It is the cumulative effect of consistent faith-filled actions that dismantle the old while building the new. Once faith becomes the authority in your life, familiar patterns lose their power, and the path to transformation becomes clear.